Peter was the sound designer of Chicago, Here's What It Takes, our brand new musical, as well as Frankenstein Revived. He's got over 60 productions under his belt at the festival, including Billy Elliot and Little Shop of Horrors last year, The Music Man, Rocky Horror Show, Guys and Dolls, Mad Woman of Shalott, Chorus Line, Shakespeare in Love, Crazy for You, Fiddler on the Roof. Tons of productions here with us at the festival. Elsewhere, Peter has worked at most of the major Canadian theaters and in US cities such as New York, Las Vegas, Boston, Los Angeles, Dallas, and Atlanta. His Broadway credits include Come Fly Away and Barrymore, and he also was sound designer on tours including Sister Act, Catch Me If You Can, Come Fly Away, Legally Blonde, and West Side Story. He received a bachelor's and master's degree in music from McGill and has won many awards, including the Suzy for Atlanta's Come Fly Away and a Dora nomination for Fire. I also did my own little research, and Peter has taught theater sound courses for the School of Creative and Performing Arts at Humber College. That must be interesting. Wonderful. Join me in welcoming Peter Mcboyle.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, this is, as I said to you just before we went on, this is so strange to not have interaction with people or even be able to see their eyes. But hello, everybody, and thank you for taking the time today. Yeah, wow, it sounds, when you read all those things, it sounds like, you know, I mean, it has been a 20, 25, 30-year career, so it does make sense that I've done a lot of things. But yeah, there you go. Stratford is my hometown, my home base, and yeah, 25 years at the festival, and it's been great. Been a great journey.
Amazing. So we think it would be really interesting to start off with how you got into this career, what sort of education you went through, even just the nugget of inspiration to get into this line of work. What drew you to theater?
Yeah, it's funny. I usually say that I didn't find theater, theater found me. And I think that's very common for a lot of people who end up in theater. It's funny, actually, you're just even using that phrase, end up in theater. It makes it sound like it was, you know, like not the plan or second choice or third choice. And that's not the case at all. It's just I didn't vision myself. And unlike a lot of designers and technical people, I didn't go to theater school. I came out of high school. I went to a fine arts school in Toronto, the Claude Watson School there. And I played trumpet. And I fell in love with music through the high school music program and some great teachers. And started playing in bands. I started playing drums and, you know, keyboards and whatever else I could play. Even if I couldn't play it, I would play it. And loved performing. But more than performing, I realized that I liked writing music and producing music. Actually, even the technical side of that. Even in high school, there's always that one person in the band who likes, you know, playing with the mixer and setting up the microphones and stuff, and that was me. And so I started getting opportunities doing a little bit of live sound, but found that where I really wanted to go was into music production. And so I started looking around about where to go. And McGill University in Montreal has an amazing program. It's a master's degree program that's based on a German, European philosophy, a German program called the Tonmeister, which I don't put on my business card, but technically I am a Tonmeister. So the Tonmeister philosophy in Europe for recording engineers and producers is a much more holistic one. So it's not just that you're just technical or that you just know how to arrange music, whatever. The Tonmeister, the approach is to have a bit of all of that. So, you know, you have to know a little bit about arranging. You need to be a musician. You need to know electrical engineering. You need to know acoustics, all these different things. So I got interested in that program, ended up taking a year off between university and high school and university to figure out where I wanted to go. And that was top of my list of where to go. And I managed to get in. But you needed to have an undergrad degree in music before you could get into the master's program. So I did my undergrad in trumpet at McGill University, and then was fortunate enough to apply. And it was basically like a 4.5-year audition for the master's program over that time. Because they have a bunch of courses you have to take to qualify for it. But anyway, got in, and there was only a few of us in each year because it was a master's program, and we all were just obsessed and ate, slept, and got everything we could out of the program, access to the studios and all of that sort of thing. But I think one of the things that in hindsight was so key was that this Tonmeister program, being a more holistic approach that incorporated, as I say, everything from acoustics and electroacoustics and arranging and all of these things, was kind of the perfect training ground to end up doing what I'm doing. I don't think the theater school approach would have worked out the same way for me. So because there you were learning how to record orchestras, you were learning how to record small ensembles. It was almost like a challenge between the students to find the weirdest ensemble you could. You know, you'd get some eclectic, you know, klezmer orchestra plus Indian percussion or whatever, and you'd have to figure out how to record it, and the weirder the better. So coming out of that program, I thought I was going to be in recording studios, maybe get into film. Those were areas that interested me. But all through my undergrad and my master's degree, I was doing live sound along the way. I was the head of sound at the concert hall at McGill for the 2 years that I was doing the master's program. And in the summers, I would work at Canada's Wonderland doing sound, all the while still recording and doing all of that. So I had this live sound experience, but then with it, this degree that was very technical, very forward thinking. And so around the time, right at the time I graduated, I got a call actually from the Stratford Festival. And they had gotten my name from somebody else who was a mutual contact. And at the time, the director of production at the time was very forward thinking. This would have been in 95, I guess, 95 or 96, somewhere around there. And he realized that technology was about to change everything. And he decided there was a position available there called sound coordinator, which was sort of like an assistant technical director responsible for the sound department. It evolved into the position that Dave Campbell does at the festival, for anybody who knows Dave. But he's definitely more of a technical director of sound, whereas the sound coordinator, this position came up, and what the director of production wanted was somebody who saw the emerging technologies, digital editing, digital consoles, all of these things coming. And he felt that the people in the theater world at the time, because theater was a slow adopter to a lot of these technologies, usually just because of budget, because technologies were very expensive and hard to implement in theater, and often not designed specifically for theater, especially in those days. So anyway, he contacted me and said, we have this position, would you be interested in applying? And I thought, hey, you know, this great company is asking me to come down for an interview. Why would I not? So I went down and met with them, and the position was very interesting. The timelines of it didn't work out that year, but then they filled it in a temporary fashion. And about a year later, I got another call saying, we still are looking. Would you like to come back? And anyway, I ended up doing it. And then as part of my getting involved with it, I said I didn't want to give up a creative bent. And so I asked if I could also get some sound design assignments as part of my time there. And so in that first season, I was given, and I had done some theater along the way. It's not like I hadn't done theater, but I was really being brought in because I understood where technology was and where it was headed, and then figured out how to apply it to theater. So I had done various theater projects and worked with choreographers and all this stuff. So it's not that the world was foreign to me, but I wasn't like this established sound designer that they were bringing in for this position. But yeah, in that first season, I ended up doing, my assignment was The Little Foxes, which was like the all-star team of the Stratford Festival for anybody who saw that show. The cast was Martha Henry, Bill Hutt, Brian Bedford, Jimmy Blendick, Peter Donaldson, Diana LeBlanc. It literally was the all-star team, and it was directed by Richard Bennett, the artistic director at the time.
No pressure, right?
Yeah, right. Now, it was a fairly simple show, but there was no composer, so it was just me to figure out what found music we were going to use for the show and create everything that was needed for it. That was a late opener. In the early opener, the sound designer who had come in for The Music Man that year, he was a live ent type, and his availability wasn't great. So they asked me to be his assistant. So there I am in my first season. I've got a show later in the season, and I'm the assistant on Music Man, learning about musicals. And then along with that, they were bringing a show that they had started in Edmonton in the off season called A Fitting Confusion, also directed by Richard Bennett. And they were bringing that into Stratford. It had already run in Edmonton. And so they needed somebody to put it up in Stratford. So they asked me to do it. So I became the associate designer on that show. or co-designer, I can't remember. So there I am, my first year at the Stratford Festival. I'm being this sound coordinator, coordinating all the shows, but then I also end up with association directly on these 3 shows. And then the last one, which really kind of, I mean, ultimately I was thrust into this world very quickly, because ultimately the last one was that in September that year, we were opening this live-ent co-production one-man show called Barrymore, starring Christopher Plummer. And they had a composer out of New York, but they didn't have anybody locally. And so they said, oh, Peter, well, could you, just cue the show and put it up? And I'm not going to say no at that point. I say, sure. And so then they ended up deciding, Chris Plummer and the director decided that they didn't actually need composed music, that it was wrong for the show. So they got rid of the composer. So that left me. So there I am building sound effects and recording voiceovers with Mr. Plummer and all of the stuff. And so in this first year, I was really catapulted into it. And as I say, like originally I thought I'd be working. I did have a job that I was doing in a recording studio in Toronto leading up to this. During my time, I was kind of doing it part-time while I was still going back and forth from Montreal to Toronto. And yeah, in a million years, during my degree, my time at McGill, I wouldn't have thought that I'd end up in theater. But there I was in this first year at the renowned Stratford Festival with my name on 4 shows. And then Barrymore went on a tour right after that. So I went down and put up the tour. And I mean, I think one of the things that's common when you talk to a lot of people, especially designers, is that, you tend to stick your neck out enough that you can crawl forward, So in those days, I didn't say no to anything, because those were your opportunities. And by doing that, suddenly there I was with a North American tour of Christopher Plummer's one-man show in Florida, setting up this tour, kind of making it up a little bit as I went along, but with, educated making it up, if that's a thing. Educatedly making it up, I think that's it. Anyway, and then, yeah, some things happened. Then the next year, there was a little personnel shift, and they ended up losing the sound designer who was, and then coinciding with that was the renovation of the Festival Theater. So I'm also, as the sound coordinator, heavily involved in figuring all of that out. And then the next year, they had lost the sound designer who was going to do Camelot, Richard Minette's musical debut. It was going to open the Festival Theater. And so they asked me to do it, which, again, I mean, that was Richard's faith. Richard was the kind of person who would really support people he believed in. And there was a case where, I might not have the career that I have if it wasn't for Richard Minette and him supporting me in that moment. So I did Camelot that year. It went very well. People enjoyed it and enjoyed my work on it. And then that led to the way it happens in this business is your work stands on its own to a certain extent. And so Paul Sportelli, who's now the director of music at the Shaw Festival for many years now, he was doing the show called The House of Martin Guerre that was this kind of a big, exciting project in Toronto. And he saw Camelot and he thought it sounded great. So they asked me to come and do House of Martin Guerre. And then you just do it. As you do more shows and people get exposed to your work, your name gets out there, and then people are phoning. And so from there, it just took off, and I started doing shows all over. The sidebar to that was that my time at Canada's Wonderland and some of those places associated me with some people who went on into another aspect of the entertainment business, into the cruise ship industry. And so I, around the same time, was in contact with people who had worked their way up in Princess Cruises, and they started hiring me to come out and do their shows and tuning their sound systems, like making their sound systems sound good and all that stuff. So I ended up with this sort of parallel career in that cruise ship industry as well, doing some of their shows, and which was great, seeing the world and living on these cruise ships while you tech them. Sometimes they're under construction and it's a nasty place to be, but often you're in, beautiful places and seeing the world. So that was great. And then, yeah, in around 2003, I guess it was, I got an opportunity to start teaching at Ryerson first. You mentioned Humber, but I taught at Ryerson for 7 years before that. So in 2003, I started teaching at the Ryerson Theater School and taught their sound courses for 7 years. And then my career in 2010, I had an opportunity to do a show, a Twyla Tharp dance musical using the music of Frank Sinatra, called Come Fly Away. And I often even I say Come From Away, and I wish I had done Come From Away because my bank account would be much larger if I had. But this beautiful show that we did using Sinatra's music and as this story told through dance, it started in Atlanta, where I got that Suzy Award, And then it went right to Broadway. It was such a hit. And there were some challenges on Broadway to really get traction to make it a hit on Broadway. But then it went to Vegas after that, and then went on a tour, and so and then went to Japan. And so, yeah, I mean, you know, I've been really fortunate along my way. But in that time in 2010, I had to choose between developing my career and continuing to teach. So I ended up giving up Ryerson at that time and concentrating on my career and where that was going. So, yeah, and then 3 or 4 years ago, I went back to teaching and went back to Humber. So, yeah.
Wow.
That's it. That's a lot of things along the way. Somewhere along the line, I got married and have 2 kids, 2 beautiful girls who are 17 and 13, and live in the great town of Stratford. So, yeah, that's how I got here.
Interesting to me to hear that something like a live orchestra recording, Canada's Wonderland, cruise ships, live theater, that they all require a similar set of skills.
They do. There is a commonality. I mean, certainly the music background is essential as a sound designer. But I think because I've ended up doing a lot of stuff that is live reinforcement, musicals and that sort of thing, I really think you do need to, I would say you walk that line between art and science. You have to have a really strong technical understanding of how it all works, how the equipment all works, how speakers work in a room, how microphones work, how all of that stuff works, and then have an artistic side of it, of how to then turn it into something and control it and manipulate it and balance it and do all of those sort of things. So, yeah, all of those things, you know, all the way along the way, I was sort of building this skill set that was perfect for theater. And then theater found me, and it was like, oh, this orchestras, I can do that. I can, you know, understand how all this stuff works. So, yeah, it's you know, other than the fact that with this crazy time that we're in, it's all stopped. It's been a great career. You know, I've been very fortunate that every step along the way has often led to other opportunities and exciting opportunities and stuff. So, yeah, it's been great.
Yeah, once your name is out there, just starting to say yes to everything. I certainly heard that in many different ways at theater school. You say yes and then figure out how to do it.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Sure, I could do that. I can be taller. I can be shorter. Whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a little bit more. You mentioned that when you started at the festival, they were aware that theater was moving into a new tech-savvy era.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean from a sound design aspect? Is that new machinery, a lot more computerized? Can you speak on what the actual
there's kind of there's kind of 2 sides to it. One is the actual equipment, I guess. You know, everything was going from being, you know, the classic analog digital type idea, but it's more than that. It's more that once you get manipulation being able to be done on a computer, you can do a heck of a lot more for a lot less. You don't have to have an analog circuit to control every aspect of what you're doing. You have computers, and as computers became more powerful and faster, then you can do more and more with computers. So that's mostly about the manipulation of sound in the space, and the production of anything that you're doing, you know, building sound effects, editing and mixing music, all of that stuff. But the other side of it is that with computer technology coming along, the computer, the ability to use computers to understand what's happening with sound has also been key. So, you know, the ability to predict what's going to happen when you put a speaker in a room, if you can emulate that room, represent that room in software, and then you can have an accurate representation of what the speaker is going to do in that room and how speakers are going to interact with each other. Sound is you know, because sound, ultimately because sound works very slowly and is harder to control, we have to think a lot more about how one speaker is going to interact with another speaker when they overlap, or when the sound from 2 speakers arrive at the same time or offset in time, as opposed to lighting, where they don't necessarily have to worry about that because light travels so much faster. So that practical reality isn't so much of a concern. They get into color mixing and all of that sort of stuff, but they don't have to worry about how one light is going to necessarily affect another. And so using computers and the modeling that's now available, we can understand what happens a lot better. And then also, I think the manufacturers are able to use computers to really to improve the quality of all the speakers and microphones and all these things, because again, they can see what's happening and they can kind of correct for things. And So all of those things has pushed the quality of the tools that we use, both in absolute quality, but also in capability, recallability. And for a place like the Stratford Festival, where you're doing repertory theater, and we might have, 4 or 5 shows even running in the same theater, that the repeatability is huge, and consistency. So in the days before digital consoles and computerized consoles, you'd have to reset. If you change something between shows, you'd have to reset it manually, and so you might not want to change things between shows for fear of messing up a show or having something drift. With computer-based systems, of course, you can just recall everything from the computer, and your systems are back up and running. I mean, the downside is that we all know computers crash. So if something happens, it's often a lot more catastrophic rather than with an analog. If an analog circuit has a problem, maybe just part of the console is a problem. But with computers, if it crashes, the whole thing is crashed. So, you have to also incorporate that into our reliability and repeatability.
Right.
But yeah, basically that's it. Is that the abilities that the computers bring, the computerization and digitization has brought to not just my world, but all of our worlds, video and lighting and all of that, is just has been kind of monumental in being able to do some of the things that we can do now.
Yeah. On that idea of when a computer crashes, it's a lot harder of an error to fix or a problem to fix. People love hearing about these harrowing last minute moments. Has there ever been, in your experience, a computer crash before a show was supposed to start? Has anything ever affected mid-show?
Oh yeah, there's been lots of those. But I mean, it's not even just in the digital time. I'll start with the first one, which was probably my worst experience at the Stratford Festival as far as technology. And it actually was I believe operator error, but it's kind of hard to do forensics to figure out exactly what went wrong. But it was the opening night of Philomena, which was Antony's, maybe his first directorial. It might have been his directorial debut at the festival, or maybe his second show. I can't remember, but it was early on in his directing career. Richard was still the artistic director, and it was Richard's return to the stage because Richard had suffered from an amazing stage fright. And he was off stage for years, like 25 years or something. He hadn't been on stage. And so we did this Italian farce called Philomena, which was actually quite funny, but also touching. And Richard was actually great. He was really quite wonderful in it. I don't know if anybody out there saw it, but we had these, there was 3 acts. And at the beginning of each act, we had this video sequence put together, and we had audio that ran with the video. Now, it didn't need to be synchronous. There was no talking, so you didn't have to worry that the sound lined up perfectly with mouths moving and stuff. And in those days, this would have been, 2000, 90, 99, somewhere 2000, somewhere in there, way back, before we had a ton of digital technology. And we didn't have a system that was reliable to be able to synchronize video and audio. We didn't just want the audio to play off the video because it didn't sound very good. So we had this system where basically the 2 operators would press go at the same time on their respective systems. So the video and the audio would roll together. And it was, it was forgiving enough that if they were off by, half a second, it wouldn't really matter. And so it had worked flawlessly through previews. It was all fine. And on opening night, we got to the beginning of the top of part 3. And the operator on the sound side, I think what happened is he went for the break at the interval, and he hit a master mute on the system. And when he came back, he forgot to unmute the system. It's kind of like on Zoom when you forget to unmute your microphone before you talk. It's, it can happen. And so the stage manager called the cue to start the video and the audio, and they did what they were supposed to do. They hit the buttons at the same time, but there was no audio because the audio was muted. So then he hit stop on the machine, and then didn't really know what was going on. Then he realized it, unmuted it, and hit it. And anyway, in the audience, I'm sitting there because as a designer, you're not operating the show. The technicians operate the show. You create the show and make it the way you want it to be, and they repeat it. Anyway, I'm sitting in the audience, opening night, freaking out as this is not going right, and sound starts coming on and coming off, and then it gets back on track. But the video now is like essentially over, and anyway, it was real catastrophe opening night, and I'm just sitting in the audience being helpless. Like, something is wrong, but there's nothing you can do. You just
Right.
you're just
And
like,
then the mingling afterwards. Like,
yeah,
congratulations,
yeah,
Peter.
exactly. Yeah. No,
Listen,
I went for a long walk around the theater, a bunch of, like, outside around the theater. It was at the Avon. Circled around about a bunch of times before I could go back in. But yeah, but I mean, that also is the magic of theater, right? There's nothing you can do. It just happens, and these things happen. The other things there have been many times I've had on tours. I've had calls from tours saying, we're about to open the house and the console won't start, or, and you're trying to talk people through it. We had a show. I had a call from a production of Mary Poppins that I had done out in Theatre Calgary, and they could not get the console booted in time for the show, and they were holding the house. They loaded the house. They were having problems. I was on the phone with the manufacturer. I was on the phone with friends who knew this console. We were all trying to, like, all of Canadian theater was rallying around trying to get the show up. And in the end, they had to cancel the show because they couldn't get the console working. The skin of my teeth one that happened, though, was that during Crazy for You at Stratford a few years ago, we had the computerized system we were using. It was during a preview, and I was sitting right next to the sound console. For whatever reason, the preview had sold really well, and the only seat was available, actually kind of thankfully, it was right next to the console. I normally don't like doing that because I don't like to, it's hard enough to be the operator who's mixing the show, to then have the sound designer sitting next to you. You don't need that added pressure. But I was sitting there for whatever reason, and sitting there watching the show. And for those of you who saw the show, there's a sequence in Act 2 where the two guys end up drunk, and they are dressed the same, Bella Zangler and whatever the other guy's name is, and they do this shtick where they're, drunk acting and comedy, and it's very, very funny sequence. But there isn't any real sound elements there. And so just as we're getting into that sequence, the scene change into that moment where they wake up and the one guy's, they're both drunk, and it's like the next morning. I look over the corner of my eye, I catch the computer screen for the operator, and I see it starts sort of parts that shouldn't be turning red are turning red. and you start seeing basically the whole computer system started going offline. And in those days, the system that we had, there was various components of the console that were located in different areas. And each module sort of reported back to say that it was happy. These were not happy, and they started going offline. And the operator looked over, he looked at me, and we're going, oh my goodness. So I lean over to him, and quietly, the show's progressing. People are acting on stage, all of this is happening. Luckily, there's no noise. It just died gracefully. And so we tried a couple of little things. I'm whispering over at him, and finally I said, we've got to reboot the whole thing. Like, we got to reload the show, and then get back to where you are in the show. And so Mike Duncan, who's now the head of sound at the Tom Patterson Theater, he was mixing the show. And so we did it in the middle of the show. We rebooted the whole thing, brought the whole thing back, got back to where we were in the show, got ready. But nobody in the audience would ever have known, because it happened at the only place in the show where you would not have noticed. The only one who noticed was Laura Burton, our musical director, because she lost her monitors, because all of a sudden the system went down and she couldn't hear anything from the stage, and she knew something was up. And then, but for her, I mean, it felt like an eternity, and it felt like we were so up against the clock, but we managed to get it back up and running, and with nobody was wiser. Yeah, I think the stage manager and the musical director were the only ones who noticed that suddenly it was like because normally they can at least hear sort of ambience through the microphone.
Wow, what a twist of fate that you were sitting right there.
Oh, I know, and the fact that we were able to, I mean, because we would have had to stop the show, and we didn't. We just kept going. So good. But there's so many of those stories where things, I mean, there was an opening I did in Boston, and I got to the theater, and I got there just before the show started, and had found out that the entire system was like frozen and was about to not work. And I walked in the building, I think, and it started working, and they're like, okay, let's go, ready to go to start the show. And afterwards they were like, oh, that was close. And I said, what happened? I said, oh yeah, the entire system was completely frozen. And so yeah, these things happen.
Wow.
But hopefully it never makes it to the stage.
Yeah, of course. It sounds like you've always been able to save it a little bit. All right, so we're halfway through our time with you, and we've got some really lovely questions submitted from folks who are watching now that I would love to kind of turn over to and see if we can answer.
Yeah, let's get to them, and I'll try not to blather on so much.
Blather is what you're here to do, Peter.
Yeah, okay, perfect.
So going back to the very beginning of a process with a director. People are curious about how that process works. Does the festival assign you to a show? Is that the director's decision? Do you create a sound design together? Are you passed something from a director? How does the creative side of that first meet?
Yeah, it's kind of all of the above. I mean, generally, the director will ask for their team, and they'll ask for people that they've worked with elsewhere or here before or whatever. Occasionally, a director, especially with sound design, there are some directors who might not have worked with a sound designer before. That's less and less now, but when I first started out, it was less common that you'd have a sound designer on every show, where the festival preferred to have a sound designer on every show.
Okay.
So in those days, yeah, there might have been some matchmaking where like, for example, on Little Foxes, Richard didn't know me at all. He was given me. But usually the director gets a chance to say, you know, and if they say, well, I don't really have a preference, then sometimes there's a little bit of matchmaking that goes on, which especially at a place like the festival, there's an advantage of working with designers who have been here before, who know the system and how it all works, and the schedule and the arc of it all, and the level that we work at and all of that sort of thing. So sometimes if the director doesn't have a preference, then there'll be some matchmaking. Or often, like when we have a director coming in, John Caird, who came in for Love's Labour's Lost, he didn't know any of the Canadian designers because he works out of the UK. So there was a lot of sort of suggestions, and he met with all of us to decide whether it was a good match or not. In those cases, but more often than not, I think that it's the director decides who they want to work with. And as far as the plan goes, it's usually a collaborative thing. Usually the director has an idea of what they want. I find that, you know, when I'm involved in a show earlier, if we do workshops on it, for example, we had done a workshop for Frankenstein 2 years ago. So I was involved in that a little bit and had conversations with Morris about it then. Or when we did this show, called that was based on The Little Prince. It was a musical. It was a beautiful show. Did it out at Theater Calgary, and almost a year and a half before we did the show, Dennis Garnham, who's the artistic director down at the Grand now, he was the artistic director out at Theater Calgary, and he directed the show. He met with all the designers. We all happened to be in Stratford, and so we had 3 days of meetings here where we talked about every aspect of the show and really brainstormed it. Those are my favorite sort of collaborations. But sometimes if you haven't been involved early on, then sometimes the director has a clearer vision of what they want coming into it. But ultimately, it's always a collaboration to try and come up with what the show wants to be. And in musicals, obviously, that also involves the musical director, and if the composer is part of the process, then obviously they have a say as well, or orchestrator. So yeah, it's all above, and it is one of the things that I love about theater is that it is so collaborative. You know, I remember going back and talking to my mentor at McGill about theater and saying, you know, maybe I kind of miss being in the studio and, you know, working on those things. And he said, what do you miss about that? You're going to sit in a dark room and listen to, you know, the snare drum over and over again. You're out working with all of these other people, and, you know, there's all these cross-pollination of ideas and stuff. And that is one of the great things about theater is how collaborative it is.
Right. Can you speak a little bit to the specific show of Here's What It Takes? Were you involved in the workshops of that? How does the balance between composer, musical director, and yourself as sound designer work?
Yeah, I mean, and then that was a great structure too, because it was very much a team that's used to working together. You know, Donna Fior as a director is again very committed to her team, and so there's certain designers that have worked with her over the years, and so we knew about Here's What It Takes years ago. And I was involved in the last workshops that we had in December. I was there for, and we actually did a live presentation in the Festival Theater that was kind of ambitious, but fun to do. And yeah, I mean, that one's also interesting too, because it was to be the first musical done at the new Tom Patterson. So some of the stuff that we did, I was involved in the design of the sound system for the Tom Patterson, and so some of the stuff that we were working on was knowing that Here's What It Takes was coming. So to figure out certain things about how to do a musical on that thrust stage, which I had done Jacques Brel on the old Tom Patterson years ago. And so I kind of knew what what it took to do Here's What It Takes. But it's terrible that I can't see people when I make a bad joke. Should have a laugh track. I should have set up some sound effects with some laughs. That would be yeah, so Here's What It Takes is interesting because, yeah, a living composer who's, Stephen Page, everybody knows he's a great collaborative person. And Franklin Braz, our musical director and director of music for the festival, a great collaborator. We had two orchestrators working on the show, one to orchestrate the show and one specifically for some dance moments in the show, the dance orchestrator. But sadly, we cut, because that show wasn't supposed to open until like last week. We really were just in rehearsals for it to actually find out what it was going to be for real, because we'd done the workshop, but we were all itching to find out what it was for real. And hopefully we will someday, because there's some great music in the show, and it really deserves to get a shot to be seen and heard. And I believe it will. It will happen someday, for sure.
Yeah.
But that is one of the nice things about the festival. I'll just say quickly that both Frankenstein and Here's What It Takes and a number of other shows, because we do workshop these shows that are in development, often you do get to be part of that process early on, or at least earlier on than at some places. So, which is always very enjoyable to be part of that process.
Right. And something so unique to theater.
Yes.
You wouldn't necessarily get that with a live orchestration or.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So I guess specifically on musicals, although I know microphones are also used in our straight plays, what sort of microphones do you use? People are always asking me about how they're buried in the wigs and interference and muting and turning back on. It can get really complicated with a big ensemble cast.
Oh yeah, it's madness actually. What we try to do is absolute madness, but it works, and it's the best we've got right now as a solution. Someday somebody will invent some better technology that will solve some of the problems that are inherent with this. But here's an example of one of the microphones that we would use on a performer, and you can see there's these little let's see if we can get in there. They're toupee clips, so it's what you would hold to.
You put it a little higher.
Hold your toupee on. Oh yeah, there you go. I don't know if you can see that, but it's got teeth on it. See, and so when you put that, it's like a beret. I don't know. My kids have them. Anyway, when you turn them, when you flip them inside out, the teeth bite down, and that's what holds it in the hair. And so yeah, generally the ideal position is sort of at the center of the hairline. And that's where I prefer to have them, or just over sort of one eye, that sort of thing. And then you clip them into the hair, or they go under the wig, prep. Sometimes they have to cut a little hole in the wig lace so that the microphone sticks out. Otherwise, it pushes down on the performer's forehead, and that's not so comfortable. And then we color them where we can so that they match the hairline or the skin tone or whatever it happens to be. If you're playing Caliban and you're green, we would try and color it green. And then, there's a long cable here, and then this is the connector part that goes into the microphone pack, wherever the microphone pack is hidden. Often they're just hidden at the sort of the base of the spine sort of area. But if you're doing Billy Elliot and you're doing all kinds of, or West Side Story, and you're doing all kinds of crazy flips, then we have to come up with different places where we can hide them, and sometimes we get very creative with where we can hide them. Sometimes on women, we're able to hide them in their wigs. The packs themselves are very, very small. I don't have anything to demonstrate it, but basically not much bigger than a cell phone battery. So the ones that we use now are by a company called Lectrosonics, and the SSMs, which stands for super small microphone. And they're those ones we can actually put two packs under a wig. So that you can have a main and a backup, and so if one fails, you can switch over to the other one without a problem. And so we started doing that on, the biggest deployment of that I think that we've done was on Chorus Line, because in Chorus Line they're wearing bodysuits. There's hardly anywhere to hide the microphone packs, and because the 19 cast members who stay on the stage, who don't get cut after the opening number, they really don't leave the stage. So we had them all double packed, so that if one failed, we could flip over to the other one. And that's the thing where I say that they're barbaric or kind of insane, what we do. I mean, this tiny little microphone. So this microphone itself costs about $650. And we just torture them. We take this little microphone capsule here where the sound comes in, and that part, gets covered in sweat and salt. We try not to, but if the microphone gets saturated with too much sweat, then it starts sounding dull and stops working. Sometimes can make some odd noises. So that's why we have a second one that we can go to. Yeah, I mean, all kinds of things can happen. The connector can get rubbed. The cable, this cable is tiny. I mean, it's like a piece of string, really. And so a break in this will take down the microphone, and so it is kind of crazy. And the other thing about these microphones is they're what we call omnidirectional, which means they pick up from all sides. A microphone like this microphone, SM58, is directional. You see these on a mic stand, and when you sing into this side, it's picking up, favors the sound coming from this side and rejects the sound coming from this side. But with these microphones, they pick up sound all around, which means that if you have Tony and Maria on a balcony singing together, a duet, the Tony's microphone is getting into Maria's microphone, and Maria's microphone, or her voice is getting into Tony's microphone. And then, as I said before, since sound is actually relatively slow, this interference causes an undesirable sound. So what we have to do is we have to try and only have Tony's mic on when Tony's singing, or only Maria's mic on when Maria's singing. Or if Tony's kind of singing into Maria's microphone, maybe we do the whole thing with just Maria's microphone. And usually with that scene, I've done West Side Story about 6 times now. And that's always that scene. They're always crammed onto some little balcony, unrealistically small balcony. And the person mixing the show has to learn every bit of choreography to watch them as they move and they pass. And that we have to remind them that they can't decide to change what they're doing. They have to, if on this line of singing they switch places, they have to do it the same every time. And it's a bit of a nightmare. But sometimes that interference, sometimes especially early on when you see a preview and we're still learning the show, you might hear where somebody accidentally, we haven't quite got the faderography of mixing it down yet, and you might have somebody who all of a sudden turns and sings or yells right into somebody else's microphone, and then mark that down and try and remember to not let that happen again, or we ask them not to do that, that kind of thing. So it is kind of crazy. I mean, but the goal is really to only have the microphones open that are needed in that moment. And when you're talking about a show like, I think Billy Elliot, we had 51 microphones in that show, between double packs and tap mic specials and all of these different things. So, you start thinking about how many microphones could be open at any given time, and how, what that does and how to control it and all of that stuff. So
that's amazing.
Yeah.
If anybody's interested in this specific muting and unmuting, there is a great behind the scenes video of the Hamilton soundboard operator.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And he's just mixing, muting. It's insane. So take a look for that.
Yeah, I know that guy. He's great. He's great. And it's a very well done video.
Yeah. And he just has to be on the whole show, as I'm sure the musical is
crazy, because you have to learn, like, the thing with it is once you start reinforcing the show, it sounds odd when somebody's not reinforced, right? You kind of become used to what that sound is. And so somebody might just have a single line that they say, yeah, or, bagels or whatever. And you have to make sure that their microphone is open just for bagels, and then you close it again to get it out of the way. So, I think some people think, oh, well, with computers, you can just automate all that, but you can't. It's organic. We don't know when they're going to say bagels. You have to learn it and operate it. So generally with the digital consoles, what we automate is we automate the show to make the show mixable. So we make it so that the microphones that the operator needs to control are controlled from this sort of middle part. And if you don't need to use them, they're put away. So it kind of cleans up for you and just gives you what you need. But you still have to operate the show manually. There's no way around that on a show. So we use the automation on the console to make the show mixable, so that we can automate any features of the console that can be automated, but still let the operator. Usually the operator is just riding an overall level of the orchestra, and the automation is happening to balance the things within the orchestra. We add scenes if there's a moment that we have to add an oboe solo, a little boost on the oboe solo, or whatever it happens to be, so that the operator can really just kind of think less about the orchestra and just do a build when they need it and pull it back again, but really concentrate on those microphones for the voices. And the festival stage, it's the hardest stage that I've ever done musicals on, because it's a thrust stage. So all the sound wants to return back to the stage. People are commonly blocked singing into each other because they're one is facing one way, and everyone's facing the audience, but they also happen to be facing each other. Whereas on a proscenium, generally everybody's kind of cheating out so that they're facing the audience. And then just the acoustics of that round space has all that energy returning back to the stage. So it's a real challenge, especially to do a show that's like a rock show, like Billy Elliot, that wants to be loud. It was written to be loud. Or even a show like Chorus Line. Those shows want to have an energy to them that really just sort of raises the level of excitement and all of that. And so to get that kind of volume on a challenging acoustic space like that. And then for those who don't know, the orchestra on the festival stage, the orchestra is actually not an orchestra pit. It's above and behind the stage. So you have this weird situation where your acoustic orchestra is actually coming from above and behind the cast. They have to be able to see the musical director on the tiny little monitors that are in each of the VOMs. They can't just look down and see the musical director there. So it's I mean, if it wasn't so satisfying to have musicals on that stage and have an experience that you can't get anywhere else, I don't know why we would do them, because they're so challenging. But part of that weird thing as a designer is you love those challenges. So
right.
Remind myself that when I'm in the middle of trying to solve a problem,
Yeah.
But yeah.
A question that was submitted that kind of ties to this. Can you help us understand what the sound operator within the audience and then the more like SM tech booth at the back of the house, how do those interact? Why is it in the house?
Yeah, it has to be in the house because the person is constantly correcting for the show. They're experiencing the show the way the audience is. So they're the checks and balances, and they're trying to make the experience of the audience as good as it can be. So they need to be in the house to hear what the house is doing, to hear what's happening. They can't be working on monitors or any of that sort of thing in a booth. So they need to be in that house. And what's weird, what we're really fortunate at the festival was in the renovation of 96 or whatever it was, 98, whenever it was. We were able to get that in-house mix position. Often, the more typical situation you see at most proscenium theaters is like at the Avon, where the mix position is at the very back of the house in the under balcony. And if you've ever sat back there, it is a different experience than hearing the show in front of the balcony, right? That the under balcony area creates a different acoustic energy. So it's harder to sort of, you need to kind of, the operator generally, they need to trust that the designer is taking care of what's happening around the room to make it mixable for them. And then often you find that the operator will, while we're in rehearsals or in certain rehearsals, will walk down to the front to see what's going on. And with some of the digital technology we have now, you can actually get out and for parts of the tech process, I'll sit down in front of the balcony and balance down there because on computer technology, we can all be connected. So, but yeah, and what that operator is doing, as I say, is really just trying to control every moment of those microphones to balance them. And then on top of the sort of opening and closing everything, you have varying degrees of vocal qualities of performers. You might have somebody like Juan Kioran, who's got a loud and proud voice that will cut. And then you might have somebody who's, you might have a child in the show who's got a very soft voice. And so we're compensating for that and trying to put them all in the same world and balance them all out as well. So there's a lot going on there. And then you might have a performer who's not feeling well that day, and they come and they say, I've got a little bit vocal thing going on. So, you have to kind of be on them a little bit extra that day to help them out. So all of those things, is what they're doing. They're really correcting for, almost like the musical director is in conducting the orchestra. You really have to experience it in that position so that you can balance it and make it consistent.
Right.
Yeah.
We've touched on so many of the other questions that came in, and we're getting to the end of our time together. I know that you have a little bit of information about the new Tpt Theater.
Oh yeah, I was just going to show and that kind of ties into the aspect of how computers also help us with these things. So I'll quickly just share my screen.
I know we're all so curious. We wish that we were sitting there right now. Yeah.
And so this is a piece of software called Calc that lets you actually look at what the speakers are doing in the space. So this is can you see that? It's on your screen. Yeah. So these yellow triangles are the audience seating platforms, or the audience rake, I don't know, the audience section. This is obviously the backstage area, and this is the thrust of the Patterson. And then there's these smaller, these are surround speakers, that sort of thing. But these are the main speakers that are suspended over the stage underneath the catwalks. And yeah, in this day and age, you can tell it to calculate, and now it's showing what the coverage looks like. You can see that we're trying to keep the coverage off the stage because obviously when you start getting speaker energy into a microphone and then sending that microphone signal back to the speaker, that's how you get feedback. So that's not a good thing. And then we're trying to get uniform coverage in the audience areas. And so, yeah, something like this software lets me, sort of really take a look at what's going on with these particular speakers. If you change an angle, it'll update it and show you what's happening if you change it to a different speaker model. So this is an example of how we can now use computers to really attempt to predict what's going to happen. So, a year before or 6 months before we even started installing the equipment, we were able to sort of predict and tweak on how we think it's going to work. Yeah, and so this is very common now when I'm doing a system design using loudspeakers. Is I'll use the various manufacturers' prediction softwares to see what's going on and to try and predict.
Can you show us where the sound operator table booth area is in the new TPT?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's not. You can't see it in this graphic because the graphic is pretty basic. But yeah, let me get rid of that. So the in-house. So again, you were asking about in-house and booth positions. So the reason we have both at the theaters is twofold. One of which is that if you don't need to use the in-house mix position, then you can close it up, cover it up, and then operate the show from the booth. So in the Tom Patterson Theater, the sound booth is up here, lighting booth is over here, stage management is up here too. But in this area here, there's some removable seats, and that's where our in-house mix position will be in seasons where we do a musical or where there's a show that requires an in-house mix. So yeah, there'll be a mixing console in that area there. Yeah, I mean, at the festival, we actually generally have both an in-house operator, like on a musical, and somebody in the booth doing sound effects, and somebody backstage taking care of all the RF mics. So it's a bigger crew there. And that's part of that is just the geography of that place. If there is a problem and you need to do some troubleshooting, there's racks of equipment all over the place. Somebody asked, I think, on one of the questions too about how that's all connected. We use fiber optic connections to connect between the mixing console and all the places where, like up by the orchestra pit where or orchestra loft where the orchestra mics get plugged in, down in the underworld where the RF mics are. We have fiber optic runs and then hardware that connects all that together.
So you really, like, you are heading up a team of folks backstage, in-house, and from a design perspective.
I mean, it's interesting because in some ways I'm the head of the team, but I'm also just like a co-head because the head of audio for the facility is also, they deal much more with the practical and technical and running the crew. I will also sometimes be doing that, but they're employees of the festival, whereas designers, we're all just free agents. So yeah, yes, I give direction to all of them and stuff, but there's also the heads of departments too that they deal with. So I work really closely with the head of department, and we work as a team to collaborate on all of this. Right.
A bit of a fun question that I'm hoping you can answer for us. How do you make thunder and lightning?
Well, the thing is, I mean, if you're fortunate enough to get a great recording, I've had some great recordings over the years. We get some good storms in Stratford or that sort of thing. And then there's also sound effects libraries. And it's about how you shape that to make it into a storm. The thing that really helps is at the festival, we have so many speakers that we can make the sound come from everywhere. And we have a lot of what are called subwoofers. And subwoofers are speakers that are specifically designed to create low frequencies. They're very large, so they're good at moving the air that's required to get really down low like you would with thunder. So we have some of those up in the very top of the crown at the Festival Theater. We have some that are sort of just off stage under the landings on either side. We have some in the VOMs. We have some on the balcony rail. We have some in the proscenium, what we call the proscenium column, these tech columns on either side of the stage. And so by having so many of those subwoofers, we can vary where the location comes from, and we can also have that real extension that you would expect in a real thunderstorm. So we can make it sound, pretty impressive. And then coordinating it with lighting, either, I mean, most cues still are called by the stage manager. So in that case, it might be sound 42 and lighting 163, and the stage manager would warn both of those shows. And then when she says go, he or she says go, both of the operators would hit their button to make them go, and they would go at the same time. Sometimes when you're doing, if you're trying to do a realistic approach of a storm, like in King Lear, you know, at the beginning, those would be offset. You'd see the flash, and then you'd hear the thunder later, and then you'd be building the tension as you know it's getting closer and closer, just like a real storm, right?
Yeah.
And now with computer technology too, we do have the capability of having both systems fired by the same button. So especially in musicals, where if you have only one operator operating the show, sometimes it's cumbersome for them to also be waiting. They usually use a cue light instead of being on headset to hear the stage manager. They're busy mixing the microphones that we talked about. And so sometimes if you want real precise timing, a bunch of things in Rocky Horror, for example, we had a system where the video would fire the sound, or the lighting computer would fire the sound. So we have the system set up so that anybody can fire anybody else's cues if you need them to, so that you can really get synchronous. Things like in Rocky, if you saw Rocky, when he was firing the laser gun or any of those things, we had those tied so that it was a lighting cue, but it would fire sound, so that when the light happened, the sound would happen exactly together.
Right.
And we had a bunch of those kind of things where video would be firing sound, or lighting would be firing sound, or sound would be firing both, you know, because and Coriolanus was actually a bit of a masterclass on all of that. I didn't work on that show, but the interaction between departments and the way they all worked was really quite remarkable.
Yeah, with the projections. And
Yeah, because again, if you're having a bold image like a projection, and there's supposed to be sound that goes with it, you want it to be exactly together. So they tied a lot of that stuff together using computers, networking.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time.
Oh, no.
There have been about 90 people watching this whole time, so that's
Fantastic.
wonderful. Thanks for tuning in. I would like to finish with a question and call back to your school days.
Okay.
Do you still play trumpet?
I do. In fact, it's sitting right here.
Amazing.
But I have to admit, I hadn't played after I graduated, I kind of put it away. Working on something like that, I stopped enjoying it, and I put it away, and then just didn't find the time. I was so busy with my career, and then family and career. And so I hadn't played it in 25 years. And a few years ago, there's a band in town called the Downing Street Collective, and there's a lot of technicians that are part of that band. And then they usually have cast members as the lead singers, and Scott Bowden is the current sort of lead singer. And it was 2 years ago, I think. We were in tech on whatever show it was that year, Guys and Dolls maybe. And we started talking about soul music and funk and all that stuff. And the guys basically said, well, you know, you should come, we need a horn section, you should come play. And I hadn't played in 25 years, but it sounded like so much fun. So we did it. I got my trumpet out and played again. And we went and we played for a night at the Revival House. And it was fun again. It hadn't been fun when you're eating and sleeping and drinking it and working on it at that level of university, it can stop. For me, it stopped being fun. Some people go on and that's their career and they love it. But for me, it wasn't, but it was fun when I got back and played again. So yeah, I'm actually kind of, one of the things that's happening with this COVID stuff is that I'm kind of rediscovering music, and both my kids play violin and brass instruments too. So yeah, so we play, it's fun.
That's great. Glad you're finding ways to keep busy.
Yeah.
All right.
Exactly.
Well, on behalf of McMaster and our seminar series here, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to do it.